would this exchange rate arrangement make it more difficult for CFA countries relative to non-CFA countries in Africa, and why?
Thank you so much for having me. I want to congratulate Ali for such an important and significant contribution to our understanding of the mechanisms and the structure, architecture of the CFA Franc Zone. And we cannot emphasize enough that it's still a myth, even after this conversation today, the myth is still going to be there because there's still a lot that is not known. I was born and raised in the Franc Zone. And I think of somebody in my home city of Mamfe in the Anglophone region of Cameroon who has acute kidney failure and doesn't have access to kidney transplant. The only maybe 3 options that are to them is recurrent dialysis, recurrent medication, and lifestyle changes. Now, if you see for these 3 options that are before them, they can't have 2. They can't have dialysis, they can't have medication. They would just have to stay on lifestyle changes like diet and or whatever. How is that really going to help this patient? This is exactly what we have. The CFA Franc Zone is as the author has clearly demonstrated in his book. We're taking away 2 important development tools from the hands of development policymakers. The exchange rate is not available for them. Monetary policy is not available to them. And even the one-lane policy that is left, fiscal policy, is still constrained. So the big question, to answer your question, is we still need to deconstruct the myth around the CFA Franc Zone, why it was even set up that way. And because we're still getting arguments that in support of the system, why it should continue. So I think an important contribution of Ali's book is to help us understand the myth and to deconstruct it. And I want to do that in 4 points. Number 1, the first myth is that the reason why these 14 Francophone African countries should stick to a colonial arrangement, monetary arrangement, and deny themselves these 2 indispensable development tools, monetary and exchange rate policies, is because they're going to benefit from unlimited convertibility of the CFA to the euro. That's a myth. As we see in practice, it seems like the unlimited convertibility of the CFA to the euro actually hurts CFA countries, actually reinforces the overvaluation of the currency. And there's research on that. Mamadou published a paper in 1997 that highlights, the kind of dynamics going on between Nigeria and Niger, the informal trade between the 2 countries, where the volume of trade between these 2 countries rises with the difficulty that Nigerians face in obtaining US dollar. And so whenever the CFA franc is overvalued, there's another self-reinforcing mechanism through the Naira CFA parallel exchange market, suggesting that the lack of competitiveness of these countries is also tied to the dynamics of the Naira CFA parallel exchange rate, in particular the ease with which or difficulty with which Nigerians have access to the dollar to import manufactured goods. That's one of the myths. The unlimited convertibility, so much acclaim of, we don't know what it means. It might actually be hurting countries. The second myth that we need to deconstruct is a myth that the reason why these 14 African countries should stick to this colonial arrangement, denying themselves 2 indispensable development policy tools, is because of the low inflation and short-term macroeconomic stability that is guaranteed by the PEC is good for them. But we have seen from the author's work that this cannot be true. This can be far from truth. The threshold by which, beyond which inflation would hurt these countries is around 10%. That's the threshold at which inflation can hurt these countries. And for the advanced countries like the United States, the threshold is above 3%. So why would anybody be targeting 2% inflation goal for 60, 70 years? And we know the short-term trade-offs of that ridiculously low inflation target is that you're going to get very high unemployment rate for the continent's youths who are in the millions trying to cross the Sahara and ending their lives prematurely. How would Sub-Saharan Africa create 20 million jobs each year with such would deny itself the development tools is a paradox. The text of the myths that we need to deconstruct, the author has done a good job on that, but we still need to sensitize the public is that the reason why these 14 African countries should stick to this arrangement, denying themselves the tools that they need for development, is because France is such an altruistic partner with sacrificing their all to help Africans. Whereas we know that Jacques Chirac, the former president of France, himself said in a speech on September 26 in 2009 that most of the banknotes that his compatriots have in their wallets come from exploitation of African continent for centuries. So how could it possibly be that France is not benefiting from this system, whereas the system is based, it has made the currency overvalued perpetually for 60 years, therefore making it cheaper for France to sell its product, and also the Francophone elites, easier for them to buy the ostentatious goods that they need from France. Finally, let me end on this, or we can go back into this conversation during that. I think we were aiming towards solutions, not the problems, but we need to understand and deconstruct the myths before we understand the solution. Finally, the fourth myth is that the reason why these 14 African countries should stick to this colonial arrangement and deny themselves two indispensable development tools is because the Francophone Africans are not smart enough to implement and manage their own independent currencies. I hear this and my heart bleeds to hear this kind of argument, and sometimes propagated by Africans themselves, especially those who have had the privilege to serve at prestigious institutions. That tells me that Afro-pessimism remains one of the elephants in the room to Africa's emergence. So I'm ending by saying, here's my message for the Afro-pessimists. I would like them to explain to me how Ghana successfully implemented its own currency, the cedi, and is currently running an independent central bank and targeting inflation very successfully. I want them also to explain to me how Mauritania, a former French colony, left the zone and implemented its own currency, the Wagua, in 1973. They might not be doing great, but they did something. I want them to also explain to me how Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, all former French colonies were able to implement and manage their own independent currencies. So the way forward, I'm going to come to your answer in the second part, but we needed to throw out these myths so that we can face the reality. And I believe in reality. I know there is an optimal solution, but there's also a solution that is more pragmatic and possible and feasible in the near term. But I'll talk about that in the second term if I have the chance. Thank you so much.
Julius, thank you very, very much for helping us, indeed, helping us demystify the myths, as you put it, the 4-point agenda for demystification, consistent with what our author Ali had also articulated brilliantly in his opening remarks. There was something you said, Julius, which makes me pivot right now to a question about the very fact that the West African countries, the conversation has been going on since Adam was a boy of a single currency in the region. And of course, most of the West African countries involved in the new, to be introduced ECHO, are also members of the CFA Franc Zone. I was just wondering, in the same vein of your point on demystifying the myths, how do you see this playing out? And after you, I would like Ali to also come in here and address this point.
Thank you, Aloysius. Thank you, Aloysius. That's a very pertinent point. And I would say we start from the macro. From the macro point of view, I think most economists agree that regionalism, regional cooperation in trade, economic, monetary, and fiscal policies is something that African countries should jealously seek, given the nature of their economies. So that's one thing they would have to keep. But how do they do that? How do you put, I'm talking about the West African currency now called monetary union, now called with this currency called ECO. How do you do that when you have a major oil importer? Ali mentioned that in his book, a major oil importer, exporter, and oil importers in the same zone. So is quite tricky. I don't know the answer, but what I could suggest, what I see as a part, and I actually agree with Ali on that, is that the Franc zone would need to continue in its subgroups. In other words, the CMAC as a group of its own, and the WIMO as a group on its own, and of course how the WIMO integrates with the other Anglophone countries is another conversation. But I think a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. So we first of all have to disentangle these countries, decouple them from the euro completely, delink them from the euro. I don't agree with Ali that a peg to any, whether a basket of currencies or this would be ideal. Right now, for me, I think that is a second best solution, because you're still going to tie the hands of policymakers around exchange rate and monetary policies that will not do these countries any good. So there is the ideal, and again, there is no solutions, it's just trade-offs. If you see where I'm going with this, there are no solutions, they're just trade-offs. What is the trade-off of pursuing a managed floating regime? The trade-off would be that these countries have a lot, or they have all their fiscal policy tools with them. They would be able to have competitive exports by fine-tuning the exchange rate, generate job expansion, reduce poverty, raise per capita income. They have the exchange rate tools to deal with shocks that come from all sorts, and balance of payments. And more importantly, Africans want a sense of national sovereignty. They need to have their own currency. So if managed float would be the first leg towards that dream, that aspiration that Africans are looking for. A peg regime would still not take them to a significant step. That's why I don't believe in the ECO, the thing that has been created in West Africa. We'll watch and see. I don't see it will go any further. What was there?